Hello and welcome to the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast, currently being recorded on location, Chris. At some cult, is that right?
Technically. We're not talking
Technically.
about that today.
I know, well, cults are secretive places, so the fact that you're undercover there, and we are broadcasting almost live from there
Almost.
is something pretty special. But anyway, so today, podcast episode named National Grid. What's that to do with? Well, all of these grid system things, Chris. I mean, I think that there's this thing that seems to have gone over my head. I don't know when this is cropped up, but it's all about grids and putting grids down and stuff.
Old
And
pyramids.
I grew up in the 90s and we had things like Lego and Duplo and all that sort of stuff, which is all grids and frames that you stick little bricks on and that. And I'm thinking, is this just the as above, so below principle working out? Is this just all these kids that have played with all of these toys and that growing up are now trying to turn that into something magical? Because all I see is these like five stones. Did you ever play that?
Three-dimensional
Five
Legos.
stones. You put all the little stones out, and then you've got to throw one, and then you've got to pick as many up as you can. That was our crystal grids back in the day.
5 stones? No, I never did that.
You never heard of 5 stones?
No.
Basically, you get 5 stones.
Yeah.
And you chuck them like you would if a room reader was chucking runes down and shit, and they go out. And then you've got one special stone, and what you have to do is throw that up in the air, and then pick up as many of those stones that are laid out as possible, and then catch that one you throw in the air. So the person that obviously picks up as many as possible and catches the one they threw wins.
So jacks.
I don't know what Jack says. I thought Jack's was a bar.
No, you had to. You had these kind of like spiky little ball things,
right?
Little prick things, and you had to throw them down, and then you had to bounce a ball, and you had to pick up all the jacks before the ball hits again.
Oh, okay.
That makes sense. I get what you're talking about now.
So jacks, crystal grids, and stones. Because I didn't realise that. What are they? Little plastic things or something?
Yeah, little. They were called something else as well before that. It's a really old game.
Well, I didn't know that you were allowed to use plastic in Magic. I thought it was all very anti-plastic. I thought you had to use the real-life crystals or fake crystals at the very least. I didn't realise you were allowed to use little plastic spiky things that look like viruses and that. Unless the only exception.
No, I don't mean for Magic.
But the only exception to using plastic in Magic, from what I've understand, is offerings when you get plastic ribbons and tie them around the tree. But I never really got that because I never really understood why you try and strangle the tree with plastic and that's somehow an offering. I've never really got that one. Could you explain that one to me, the thought process behind that? Because I figured that they were trying to pay homage to the land spirit of the tree, but maybe what they're doing is they're paying homage to a different tree and they're trying to kill off its enemies by strangling them. I don't know.
Maybe. But is it not hashtag all about the intention?
Maybe all of the fact that it's plastic means they will last 1,000 years. So
maybe that's what they were going.
Maybe your offering lasts longer because they don't want to make. If you go off to Glastonbury and you come from abroad or somewhere like that, you don't want to have to keep making that trip every year, do you? If you do it once and leave a plastic ribbon, that's good for 1,000 years or so.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. Okay, we need to get back on topic. You're doing that tangent thing again. So we need to talk about grids.
So is this crystal grids that I hear so much about?
Well, I think it's all kind of grids. Like there's lots of practitioners now that
Cattle grids.
rather
They're designed
rather
to
than use.
trap cattle, Chris. Do you see where I'm going with this? Cattle
I can see
grids
what
are
you're saying.
designed to trap cattle. But what about these crystal grids and stuff? What are they designed to trap? Are they designed to trap something, or are they designed to trap the person that lays them?
I think they're to trap the person that lays them so that they can't get
Ah.
interfered with by other people. Also, aren't they power grids too? Don't you get those too? Where it's kind of like they lay them out and then they charge up the grid in this kind of three-dimensional Metatron's cube kind of shit. Isn't it like a
Oh,
bastardization of that?
they do love a Metatron's cube, don't they?
So it's all about the copper the copper pyramids now for directing energy down.
Oh, and the Organite pyramids, and isn't that what they make Organite?
Organite.
Love a bit
Let's
of
not talk about
Organite.
Organite. That we can slag that off another time. So, what exactly do we want to hit first? The idea of grids in general first?
Yeah, probably best educate people on what the idea of grids are, because I don't think I'm fully understanding myself, because I thought I understood the principles, having looked at it and read the energy and seen what's going on. But when I got some books from Llewellyn, you know, that publishing company we like,
Yeah.
I was a little confused. I'm not going to lie. Because,
what did they say?
well, they said that you get a pretty pattern and then you put very specific pretty crystals in very specific places, and then the magic happens somehow. They didn't really explain how the magic happens, but then the crystal book often doesn't explain how the magic happens. They just says something about frequency is normally the word that gets used. But any grids that I've made, I don't think I've used crystals. I think I've got one crystal that's attached to a kind of a grid. But apart from that, normally I've done it with talismanic type magic before. Or maybe the carving of sigils and runes and things like that. I've never really gone for this kind of, the idea of the grid to me is to make something go over a bigger area, whereas what I'm seeing is I'm seeing a pretty little cloth with a pretty little picture on, and it's basically almost like a tarot spread in front of you.
Oh, okay. I get what you mean.
So
Yeah,
what's your ideas of these grids, magical grids, and that then?
Well, a part of it, I think it's a messing. It's somewhere between Metatron's cube and this idea of magic circles and ceremonial magic. So I'm used to seeing them from this point. So they're kind of protection barriers, and also creating sacred space. Kind of that idea of throwing down a space within a space. What I don't quite understand is when they layer grids up, other than obviously when you're talking about protecting a space. But I will talk about that separately, because I think that's actually got a little bit more merit. But what we're talking about is kind of what the kind of New Ages are doing and the Wiccans with the grids, which is all about creating a sacred space in which to perform a certain kind of magic. So I think, which, you know, apparently they perform magic. I've not seen any, but there is that kind of that idea of throwing down grid.
You're
and
such a nasty bitch.
throwing down a grid and then creating a certain kind of energy within that space. And then sorry, it was because I was reading. Did you see the little argument I had with somebody on the YouTube the other day about Scott Cunningham books? Because if you haven't seen the What Would Scott Cunningham Use
Yeah, on the
podcast, you
Scott
need to go listen
Cunningham
to that.
Use podcast on YouTube, I did see something like that. It flashed up that
Yeah.
you were having an argument with some idiot.
So yeah, so I think it's one of those, because he or she called them teachings. So, because obviously Scott Cunningham, even though half his books were written after he died, he was clearly a spiritual teacher, like Gandhi. You know, we totally put them on the same shelf.
Well, he's the Wiccan Messiah, Chris.
Hashtag the Wiccan Messiah. But we haven't done that one yet, have we? We need to do
No,
that
but then
episode at some point.
I was going to see if we could get a real life Wiccan on the podcast to discuss it.
Okay, okay.
I was going to
But
catch one in the wild.
a real
A real one.
traditional one,
A,
or
re-
actually just one of
a
these people
real
that does the
a
plastic
real
ribbons?
initiated one that can trace their lineage back and stuff, because that's the legitimate ones, isn't it?
Ooh,
I reckon I could probably find
yeah,
one.
I'd like to do that. That would be fun because we can have a real conversation then. Hopefully,
Yeah.
see if they actually know anything. So yeah, so we were talking about grids in that kind of sense. I think it's kind of borrowed from the New Agers and their use of creating space for like yoga and things like that, where they start to use them in kind of healing grids. And I think it's kind of they've taken that and then they've run with it into their own practices. And they don't seem to. I don't think they totally understand how the two interconnect and how you could use them. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just don't think that how they're being used is the same as what they could be used for. So, you know, you could charge grids and systems, and, you know, you could even put permanent grids down that actually interacted with ley lines
That
or
makes
something like
most
that in
sense
order
to
to
me.
create energy fields. You know, so kind of mimicking what's going on with, you know, sacred sites and things. And, you know, if you had the right minerals involved, and I don't mean crystals, but if you had the whole minerals going on, in order to kind of recharge and redirect the energy with kind of heavy metal stone or something like that, that allowed it to kind of reverberate through. You could create, obviously, we know Mr. Railroad likes his circles. Maybe he could create some kind of mega grid and get back to us.
Mr. Railroad was, last time I remember, he was investigating stone circles and those kinds of things. So I don't know what he's been up to with that. I think he made his own at one point during the COVID stuff. So,
Yeah, I think
so
he did.
making your own Stonehenge in the garden, would that be a class as a grid?
I suppose so. It feeds in the same way because I suppose when I see grids, I don't know about you, I think of microchips and computer motherboards rather than
Circuits, yeah.
Metatron's cube. I see
Yeah,
circuits where
I see
you,
circuits.
um, you know, create Faraday's cages and things like that in order to literally box in a space. So, you know, if you wanted free flowing energy, then you've got to kind of be careful about how you set up a grid like that, which is where it's kind of it's got potential, but isn't really pushing where I feel it should be pushing, or at least not in the people that I've seen. Maybe they are also doing it that way, but I doubt it.
Okay, so when would you personally make a grid system and what would you possibly use it for? Because you probably wouldn't be doing it for spellcast and stuff, would you?
No, so I might pop up a grid, or at least what would look like a grid, I guess, from an outside perspective, if I needed to ward a space that wasn't my own. I suppose that's probably the only time I would really use it. So I suppose it's difficult to kind of bear up in mind what we're actually talking about when we do that. So, but these is the kind of, you know, you've got the kind of building up of these grid systems, I think is mostly taken from closer to that kind of creating permanent space, which I think is the iffy bit about it, is the idea of creating permanent space, because obviously the whole idea with those would be energy would run over it. So, you know, how do you integrate that into a permanent space and clean it and maintain it that way? Particularly when you're using crystals, which obviously need to be charged and then released, charge and release. That seems really repetitive. And you know what how we feel about repetitiveness in practice. starts to make people lazy.
So kind of permanent, um, I wouldn't say charms, but permanent magical work that is kind of utility based. So I'm kind of thinking buildings have security alarms, they have fire alarms, automation, that kind of thing. That's really what you're talking about because you don't really have to do anything other than maintain the system. So as long as you're
Yeah,
maintaining the fire system, whenever there's a fire, the sensors pick it up and warn you there's a fire by setting a bell off and then calling the fire brigade. So
yeah,
most of these grid systems, I'd say, is kind of permanent magic that is automated. Is that the best way to put it?
yeah, 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 yeah. So it does have merit. I've seen people do effective ones that are set up as protective grids. They're charged in a very different way. They don't use crystals for starters.
Mm.
So they are integrated with the land in order to make them work permanently. But yeah, I always advise that obviously, if you've got a permanent system like that, that those grids get dirty. It may stop certain things coming through, but then if you've got something that can overpower the grid or is small enough to sneak through the grid, then you still have to be constantly watching, and you also need to be kind of checking it and cleaning that because even if you get one of those fly zappers, all the dead flies sit in the bottom of it, so you still have to clean it out on a regular basis. So that but generally, yeah, like you say, that you're talking about a system that kind of runs itself, has its own alarm system in it for when it's being triggered, and it's something that you can kind of routinely um, inspect and recharge, I guess.
When I was at school, we used to have to design, because I did system and control and electronics, so we used to have to design basic systems. And obviously, it's logic driven. So it's a logic driven system, much like a
Yeah,
flow chart. And you would create a program that would go in, those little black chips with the little legs, look like kind of spidery woodlice things. We used to have to
yeah,
design programs, download them into the little pick chips, and then attach those to circuit boards, and then they'd run a thing. And obviously, the more
okay,
we kind of got points or were assessed on how many I don't know what you'd probably put it as, but you've got to come up with every scenario, I suppose. So if you're designing a little machine or something like that,
yeah,
then you know what you want the machine to do, but there are going to be different factors. Sometimes things won't quite work out. Sometimes they will. So I made this little putting machine and stuff like that where you'd hit the ball doing putting for golf, and then it was designed to basically send your ball back, but you had to design like a chip that would
yeah,
run it. Security alarms and things
yeah,
like that are a really, really good one for that sort of thing
yeah,
because they're logic based. Is there something in the room?
yeah. But it's
Set the alarm off.
it's one of those
Is
things
it a
that
cat, Val?
you have to debug it.
Don't set the alarm off. So, it's stuff
Yeah,
like that. It can get super complicated, but the idea is a logic based system that if something happens, it does something or it reacts and it kind of channels energy that way. So, what's some of the most simplest ones that you've come across that you've not made yourself, that you've just kind of seen other people make? Maybe talk a little bit about when you might see them out and about and maybe never even realize.
yeah. So kind of like you see them with kind of spaces that have been created for communal work. I find those are the ones you see the most frequently, where they're kind of mini versions of like Stonehenge, but not in a true sense, but in they hold a certain level of energy and they kind of cloak it
Mm,
often in a kind of what you call it, glamour magic
yeah.
that makes you unaware of that, the fact that it's there. So those sorts of things that are kind of, unless you're tuned in and used to seeing those things, they wouldn't even to a mundane, they'd walk past them. But it stops them walking through the zone. So it keeps it maintained and allows you to kind of not trip the circuit, and it kind of sends out an energy that makes you avoid it. So those are some of the best ones I've seen. And then I've also seen people use them for two kinds of protection. So even kind of, kind of permanent home setups where you have grids within grids within grids, so that you've got like fail safe within fail safe, and then you've obviously got a permanent panic room. Is the best ones I've seen that kind of create these kind of around about a working space or something like that, that then has kind of perimeter fences around that. Um, but you have to be careful with things like that, because they can start to become a bit much like a prison if you're not making sure the energy is allowed to flow through every now and again, and kind of recharge and reset up. And then I suppose the other one is these kind of temporary grids that you throw down, like I was talking about before, which is probably the only way I would probably come close to using them, is when I throw wards down when you're in a space that you don't want to be seen. Um, so, if you're going into a spirit infested psychic rat's nest that's kind of like I don't know, a psych ward, or, some of these old abandoned buildings where crazy people have been, um, those sorts of, psychiatric facilities that are long gone, abandoned, but they've still got an air about them. And I've seen people kind of go into investigate, and I don't mean paranormal investigators, I mean actual witches going in to investigate, and they are seeing and kind of going, okay, I need a workspace, I need the pop-up workspace right now. So I've seen people use those in those sorts of ways, but I don't know whether or not I'd call those grids. They're kind of a bit of a hybrid. Um, so they kind of make sense calling them a grid, but they're not really a grid, if that makes sense. It's kind of a pop-up workspace rather than, um, you know, a grid within a grid within a grid. It's the same way you do a magic circle, just a different shape. Like essentially, that's what that is.
Well, the definition of grid is a network of lines that cross each other to form a series of squares or rectangles, or a framework of space bars that are parallel to or cross each other. So essentially the takeaway from this, I think, if you're talking magically, like with the circuits, you're talking a group of objects or things that interact with each other to create a barrier or to absorb or to interact with an environment. Because the idea, kind of like if you think satellites, one satellite will get you coverage over the world but will move around. But if you've got enough satellites that they're all working together for your GPS, you've got coverage all over the world. That's the best way of thinking about it.
Permanently.
But
Yeah.
it gets more complicated in if you're thinking about kind of electronics. Each of those components that are in a circuit do something different. Whereas if it's lights, a grid of lights, all of those lights potentially might do the same thing. They might just light up, but at the same time, it might be a bit more sophisticated, and some things might light up, others might not, and it might spell something out. So you're talking groups of. Normally, I find there's something tangible involved with laying grids, because you could potentially obviously do it in the astral, but most of the grids I tend to see people use, it's reinforced with something physical. So, the idea is I see a lot with protection magic, normally with grids. And the grids can be used a lot more than that. I think the mistake I see people make is when they look at sacred sites and things, or let's say permanent grids put down, and they automatically look and they think, that must be protection, that must be to fortify a boundary. When actually, when we talk about evocation, we talk about creating certain environments. You could use a grid system to maintain an environment permanently. If you wanted to maintain some sort of doorway or something like that to another realm, or you wanted to maintain an area, say you do a lot of necromantic work with the dead, well, you don't want to keep on having to, put a lot of maintenance into creating an area for the dead to manifest in. Instead, you might use a grid. Now, let's talk graveyards.
Yeah.
And then after
Without sounding
graveyards,
like one of those
yeah, oh yeah,
UFO
UFO
people.
bloody people. We should talk graveyards because that'll probably be a basic. And then when we go into the Patreon, I want to talk sacred sites in general, and then maybe some Egyptian temples and that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
the idea of the graveyards retain a certain energy, but that energy doesn't necessarily leave that place, does it? And we have
No.
in graveyards, there's to a certain extent, much like churches or temples and that, there are certain specific layouts. And the trick with grids, I think, is the laying out. People don't necessarily notice a grid. Mundanes don't notice a grid necessarily by the energy. A lot of them will notice things by repeating patterns. Why is that there? Why is there so many columns that way and so many columns that way? Oh, it's a mystery. It's a mathematical mystery. No, it's not. It's for a specific reason. You just don't understand it. Graveyards is something quite simple, really, to start off with, but you can go the further I think you go into investigating the energy of graveyards, particularly modern ones, the darker, more sinister I think it becomes. Because think about what a graveyard is. It's a place where you bury dead people. What would you want to use a graveyard for if it was a machine, or if a graveyard was a machine? What would that machine do? And when you start thinking about that, and then you go to a graveyard and you look it out for, okay, what's the grid system? How does this work? What's the energy going on there? Go into certain graveyards, you'd get a shock. And I don't mean an electric shock, although you might get that as well.
Well, you might do. It depends on how recent the burials are. That constant cycle of, oh well, those have been dead long enough now, we can reuse that space, starts to make it look more like a recycling centre, rather than a place of rest and quiet contemplation.
Well, I mean, a lot of the mundanes would say, oh, graveyard's scary, don't like that. All of these boundaries and guardians are to keep the dead away from me so that their dead don't leave the graveyard type thing. So it's almost like a playpen, you know? You drop your kids off at the playpen and then they can't get out until you go along and let them out type thing. But actually, when you go to a lot of graveyards, you'll find that it may be a little bit more sinister than that. The Christian graveyards, if you look at the way they're laid out and the grid systems that they use, there's some scary secrets there that we're basically running out of time on the regular edition of the podcast. So I think I might have to reveal those secrets on the Patreon, Chris. It's a shame, isn't it, that I cannot talk about these things in the next minute.
Yeah.
And that I'm going to have to go over to extra time to talk.
Let's face it, all they've got to think about is paying a couple of quid and they can listen to it.
I mean, some people would say we plan this, Chris. Some people would say, well, you could give us the basic gist of this super secret thing in graveyards that I've never really thought about, that is going to be an epiphany in like a minute or so. But instead, you two are just guessing and talking and telling people to join the Patreon. I'm thinking that this is some sort of way of you getting me to join the Patreon and give you money. What do you say to those sorts of people, Chris?
I say, why not?
Yeah. So if you want
people out there charge a hell of a lot more for a lot less.
If you want the mystery that many witches have noticed about graveyards and their real purpose, not just a storage facility of the dead, their real purpose, the sinister purpose, then you're going to have to join the Thoth Witchcraft Patreon. If you do join, you also get mentoring from us. So, you know, it's not just about listening to the extended editions. You also get, even on the minimum tier, you get to chat with us. And, like, if you take us on as your mentors, we'll set you all sorts of cool homework and shit, some of which might be involved making a grids and tinkering with ones. So there we go. We're out of time now. We're out of time now, so we'll have to say goodbye to the regular listeners of the Thoth. What is this? The No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast. Bye, everyone.